The sun hung high over Oakdale Heights, bathing the picturesque neighborhood in a golden hue. It was the perfect day for a family gathering. The Parker family had just settled into their new home, excited to start a new chapter in this tranquil suburban paradise. Jason Parker, a tall black man with broad shoulders in his 40s, stood confidently over the grill in the backyard. His easy smile reflected the pride he felt for the life he and his wife Lisa had built. Jason was the kind of man whose presence commanded respect, though he never sought it. His wife Lisa, a warm and lively woman, was nearby chatting with a small group of their friends. The aroma of barbecue ribs and grilled vegetables filled the air, while the sound of his children Zoe and Marcus laughing echoed in the background as they played with water balloons on the freshly cut grass. It was the Parker family's first weekend in their new neighborhood, and they wanted to make a good impression. Moving to Oakdale Heights felt like the culmination of years of hard work, long hours, and sacrifices. Jason had risen through the ranks in the police department, earning his place the hard way. Now, as a police captain, he felt a deep sense of responsibility toward his family and his community. Today's barbecue was more than an opportunity to relax. It was a chance to introduce themselves to their new neighbors and start building lasting friendships. Lisa placed a tray of lemonade on the picnic table, her eyes scanning the yard. She caught Jason's gaze and gave him a wink. "Looks like everything's going well," she said with a voice full of satisfaction. Jason nodded in agreement, flipping some burgers while greeting a couple of neighbors walking their dog down the sidewalk. But not everyone in Oakdale Heights shared the same enthusiasm for the Parkers' arrival. Just a few houses down, behind a thick lace curtain, Mrs. Margaret Caldwell stood at her window, watching angrily as the scene unfolded in the Parkers' backyard. Margaret had lived in the neighborhood for almost 40 years. She had seen it all: families coming and going, new developments, and the subtle changes creeping into her once perfect neighborhood. But nothing had disturbed her more than seeing the Parkers move in. From the moment she saw the moving truck, Margaret felt that something was wrong. She didn't know Jason or Lisa and had never spoken to them, but she didn't need to. She had already labeled them in her mind. People like them don't belong in Oakdale Heights, she thought. And today, watching from her window as more cars arrived at the Parkers' house, her frustration grew. "They think they can just move in and take over," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. She counted each person entering the Parkers' yard, her face tightening with each new arrival. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't used to this kind of energy, and the idea of a diverse family at the center of it all only fueled her anger. Determined to do something about it, she stormed into her kitchen, grabbed her phone, and quickly dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said with an agitated tone to the dispatcher. "There's a large group of people having a noisy party in my neighborhood. It seems like it could get out of control. They need someone sent to check it out." The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent shortly. Satisfied, Mrs. Caldwell hung up and returned to her window with a satisfied smile creeping onto her face. "That'll teach them," she thought, retreating to the comfortable and orderly silence of her living room. Jason could feel the weight of every glance in the yard. He recognized the officer, a young man named Officer Brooks who had recently joined the force. Jason had briefly mentored him during his training days. "Good afternoon, sir," Officer Brooks said in a calm and professional voice. "We received a noise complaint about a gathering that might be getting out of control. I just need to check things out." Jason nodded, offering a polite but firm smile. "No problem, officer. We're just having a small family barbecue. Everything is under control here," he said, gesturing toward the yard where the children were still playing and the guests were calmly chatting. The scene was far from chaotic. Before Officer Brooks could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Those are them. That's the family causing all the noise." Mrs. Caldwell had stepped out of her house and was heading toward the officer, her arms firmly crossed over her chest and her face marked by an expression of sheer disapproval. Jason clenched his jaw, but remained silent. It wasn't his first encounter with someone like Mrs. Caldwell, but that didn't make it any easier to endure. As the tension in the air thickened, Jason knew that this moment, this confrontation, was about to reveal much more than a simple noise complaint. It would unveil the deeply ingrained prejudices that still persisted in places where they were least expected. The confrontation and the revelation of tension in the air became palpable as Mrs. Caldwell approached Jason, her disapproving gaze cutting through the warm and friendly atmosphere that had previously enveloped the barbecue. The once joyful gathering now felt under scrutiny, and everyone in the backyard, from the guests to the children, could feel the change. Conversations were reduced to whispers, and all eyes were on the unfolding scene. Officer Brooks, who until that moment had been entirely professional, now seemed trapped in an awkward situation. He glanced between Mrs. Caldwell and Jason, visibly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. However, Jason had seen this type of situation too many times in his years on the force. He knew when to stay calm and when to act with determination, but at that moment, it was a fine line to walk. He felt the weight of his responsibility not only as a father and husband, but also as a community leader. "Ma'am," Officer Brooks began, trying to regain control of the conversation, "I understand you filed a complaint, but for now, everything seems to be quiet. There doesn't appear to be any disturbance here." Mrs. Caldwell spat out the words, "quiet," her voice dripping with disdain. "There's loud music, too many people, and children running around uncontrolled. This is a quiet neighborhood. We don't need this kind of chaos. These people," she paused, casting a deliberate glance at Jason and the guests behind him, "they're disturbing the peace." Jason clenched his fists momentarily, but kept his calm, taking a deep breath. He knew the type of person Mrs. Caldwell was without needing to exchange more than a few words with her. She probably saw him and his family as a disturbance to the suburban harmony she believed she controlled. Jason took a step forward, keeping his voice steady. "Officer, as you can see, this is a family gathering. We're not causing any harm, and the music isn't loud enough to bother anyone beyond a couple of houses. In fact," he continued, lowering his voice slightly, "I've had many barbecues like this in other neighborhoods and never had a problem." His statement hung in the air, and the weight of it didn't go unnoticed by either the officer or the guests watching. Jason wasn't just pointing out the hypocrisy in Mrs. Caldwell's complaint. He was also highlighting the often unspoken reality that people like him were judged differently in neighborhoods like this. Officer Brooks cleared his throat, clearly trying to maintain professionalism amid the growing tension. "Sir," he said, addressing Jason directly, "it seems like everything is in order here. I'll write up a report and note that the complaint has been reviewed, but there doesn't appear to be a need for further action." The guests behind Jason began to relax slightly upon hearing that the situation seemed to be under control, but Mrs. Caldwell wasn't finished. Her face twisted with frustration as she took another step toward the officer. "Are you going to let them continue? This is a respectable neighborhood. We don't need large, disruptive parties here." "Why can't they just, ma'am?" Jason interrupted her, his voice calm but firm. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Mrs. Caldwell and Officer Brooks, his eyes locking onto hers. "We are your neighbors. We're having a family barbecue, just like anyone else in this community. You can't call the police every time something doesn't go your way. We're not going anywhere." There was unmistakable strength in Jason's voice. It was no longer just a statement of defiance, but a declaration of belonging. The fact that they had moved to this neighborhood meant they had earned their place here, and nothing Mrs. Caldwell could do would change that. For a moment, Mrs. Caldwell hesitated. The intensity in Jason's eyes, his presence, and his firm yet respectful posture shook her. She hadn't expected a confrontation, at least not one like this. She had expected to make her call, have the police shut down the gathering, and return to her quiet, controlled world. But now, face to face with Jason, she realized she had miscalculated. This man wasn't going to back down. Before Mrs. Caldwell could respond, Lisa appeared beside Jason. She had been watching the interaction from a distance, letting her husband take the lead, but now felt it was time to intervene. "Ma'am," Lisa said in a measured but unmistakably direct voice, "we understand that you may not know us yet, but we are also part of this neighborhood. We're raising our children here, just as you did. We're not here to cause problems. We're here to live our lives like anyone else." Mrs. Caldwell turned her gaze to Lisa, her expression unrecognizable. For a moment, The two women stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, and then, without saying another word, Mrs. Caldwell huffed, turned around, and walked back to her house. The sound of her shoes hitting the pavement was the only noise that broke the silence. Jason watched her leave, his hands still clenched at his sides. He knew this wasn't over. People like Mrs. Caldwell weren't going to simply leave. But for now, the immediate threat had passed. Officer Brooks moved awkwardly, clearly relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further. He nodded toward Jason. "If there's anything else, don't hesitate to call us. Otherwise, I think everything is fine here," he said, softening his voice. For a brief moment, a look of understanding passed between the two men. Jason nodded. "Thank you, officer. Have a good," he said, "day." As Officer Brooks returned to his car and drove away, the guests slowly resumed their conversations. Although the relaxed atmosphere of the barbecue had changed, Jason could feel the looks from his friends and family on him, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the entire day pressing down on his shoulders. Lisa placed a hand on his arm, giving him a comforting squeeze. "You handled that perfectly," she said softly, her eyes full of pride. Jason let out a long sigh he hadn't realized he was holding. "I don't know about that," he replied, looking toward Mrs. Caldwell's house, "but I'm not going to let someone like her make us feel like we don't belong." Lisa nodded in agreement, but there was also a heaviness in her gaze. She knew today was just the beginning. There would be other confrontations, other moments where they would have to prove themselves in a neighborhood that might not fully accept them. But together, they were strong enough to face it. As the barbecue continued, Jason's thoughts kept returning to Mrs. Caldwell and how she had looked at him and his family. It wasn't new, not even surprising, but it was still exhausting. He had worked his entire life to build a future for himself and his family, and no one, especially not a woman hiding behind her judgmental curtain, was going to take it away from him. But as the day faded into evening and the last guests left, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Mrs. Caldwell might have walked away today, but her presence lingered. She wasn't done with them, and he knew that sooner or later, there would be another confrontation. The question was, how far would she go? Several days passed after the tense confrontation at the Parker family's barbecue, but the uneasy silence that followed was anything but peaceful. The warm summer atmosphere of Oakdale Heights seemed to have cooled, as if the entire neighborhood had taken a collective breath, waiting for the next spark. Jason and Lisa continued with their routines, determined not to let the confrontation define their experience in their new home. But beneath the surface, both could feel it. The storm was still brewing. Jason had returned to his duties at the precinct as a police captain. His days were filled with meetings, managing his team, and navigating the tangled bureaucratic paperwork that seemed to accompany every decision. But no matter how much he immersed himself in his work, a small part of his mind remained fixed on that Saturday afternoon and Mrs. Caldwell's brazen attempt to undermine their place in the community. Jason had dealt with racism before, both subtle and overt, but something about the incident stayed with him. Maybe it was the fact that it had happened in his own front yard, in the space where his children were supposed to feel safe and carefree, or maybe it was the lingering suspicion that Mrs. Caldwell wasn't done with them yet. Lisa had also felt the change in the atmosphere at the grocery store. She noticed the sidelong glances from neighbors who had once been nothing more than polite before the barbecue. At first, she attributed it to paranoia, but it became clear that the word had spread. Mrs. Caldwell had likely spoken to others in Oakdale Heights, which once felt like an idyllic haven, now felt colder. It was as if they had been labeled as outsiders, people to watch and whisper about. One afternoon, while Lisa was picking up Zoe and Marcus from school, she overheard a conversation between two mothers near the entrance. "Did you hear about the new family on Maple Street?" one of the women whispered, her voice low but clear enough for Lisa to understand the words. "They had a huge party last weekend, I heard." "The police were called," the other mother exclaimed, instinctively covering her mouth with her hand. "No, really, that's not the kind of things we need around here. This is supposed to be a quiet and nice neighborhood." Lisa's stomach tightened as she guided her children to the car. She didn't know whether to confront them or ignore it. She had never been one to avoid difficult conversations, but this was different. It wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a friendly chat over coffee. This was something deeper, something uglier that had nothing to do with noise or parties. As the days passed, small things started happening. Jason noticed that his trash cans were being overturned more frequently than usual, even when the weather was calm. One afternoon, Lisa came home to find a flyer stuck to her door, a welcome pamphlet subtly disguised as the Oakdale Heights Neighborhood Association, outlining the community's expectations for maintaining property standards, noise levels, and respect for the neighborhood's character. It wasn't explicitly directed at them, but the timing was clear. They were being watched. Jason and Lisa tried not to let these things affect them. They had faced challenges before, much worse than meddling neighbors and passive-aggressive notes, but it was the constant accumulation of these small acts that began to wear them down. One Friday afternoon, as Jason was finishing paperwork at the precinct, he received a text message from Lisa. "You won't believe what just happened. Mrs. Caldwell did it again. She's talking to people in the park saying we're problematic." Jason's blood boiled as he read the message. He quickly finished his work and headed home with his mind racing. Upon arrival, he found Lisa sitting on the porch, arms crossed, watching Zoe and Marcus play in the yard. The setting sun cast long shadows over the grass, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming jasmine, but the peaceful scene did little to calm Jason's frustration. "What did she say this time?" Jason asked as he sat beside her. Lisa shook her head. "I heard she was talking to some of the other mothers in the park. She's telling them we're disruptive and that we don't fit in here. She even said something about worrying about the neighborhood's safety with all the chaos we bring." Jason clenched his jaw. "Incredible. It's not just that," Lisa continued, her voice now lower. "I think she's trying to turn people against us. I've seen how some of the neighbors look at us now. It's like they're waiting for us to do something wrong, something that justifies how they already feel." Jason ran a hand through his hair, his mind wandering. He had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, that if they simply lived their lives, treated people with respect, and stayed true to their values, everything would sort itself out. But now it was clear that Mrs. Caldwell wasn't going to let them simply exist. She was determined to turn their presence here into a problem. "What do we do?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "We can't just let her keep doing this," Jason replied, "but if we confront her, it will seem like we're causing more problems." Jason thought for a moment, looking down the street where Mrs. Caldwell's house stood like a shadow. He knew that confronting her directly wasn't the answer, at least not yet. He needed to be strategic. Mrs. Caldwell was the kind of person who thrived on conflict, who would use any opportunity to paint them negatively. But there was one thing she didn't know. Jason was more than just a new neighbor. He was the captain of the local police force, a respected figure in the very community she was trying to use against them. "Let's stay calm," Jason finally said, turning to face Lisa. "We'll keep living our lives and doing what we've always done, but I'll talk to some people at the precinct. If she's spreading lies or inciting any kind of trouble, we'll handle it legally." Lisa nodded, though the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. "Just that I don't want the kids to feel like they don't belong here," she said. "They will," Jason responded firmly. "We've worked too hard for someone like her to take that away from us." Days turned into weeks, and although Jason and Lisa tried to focus on their family and work, the tension with Mrs. Caldwell persisted. She continued spreading rumors, planting seeds of doubt in the neighbors' minds. Jason began noticing small gatherings near his house, conversations that stopped abruptly whenever he or Lisa walked by. But despite everything, the Parkers refused to be expelled. They dedicated themselves to their community, offering their time at local events, attending municipal meetings, and getting to know neighbors who were willing to give them a chance. Gradually, they began to carve out a place for themselves, building friendships and connections that Mrs. Caldwell couldn't touch. Still, the strain of living under constant scrutiny was wearing them down, especially Jason at the precinct. He was a well-respected man, someone who commanded authority and respect, but at home, he felt like he was always under attack, needing to constantly prove that he and his family belonged. Oakdale Heights hadn't climbed positions within the department, surviving years of hardships and adversities only to be undermined by a petty and vindictive neighbor. One night, After an especially exhausting day at work, Jason sat down at the dining table with Lisa. The children were upstairs finishing their homework, and the house was unusually quiet. "I've had enough of her game," Jason said suddenly, his voice low but resolute. Lisa looked at him worriedly, blinking in his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've had enough of waiting for her next move. She's already convincing some of the neighbors that we're the problem, and it's only going to get worse if we don't take a stand. Tomorrow, I'll call a meeting at City Hall. I'm going to bring everything to light. If Mrs. Caldwell wants to drag us through the mud, she'll have to do it in front of the entire community." Lisa looked at him intently, her eyes wide open. "Are you sure that's a good idea? What if it goes wrong?" "It won't," Jason said firmly. "I've had enough. It's time to show her and everyone who we really are." "I'm convinced," Lisa replied. Jason thought about his action plan. He sat at the dining table until late at night, staring at the papers in front of him. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound filling the room, as the rest of the house had fallen asleep hours earlier. However, his mind was racing. He had been going over every possible scenario of what could happen at the City Hall meeting he had called. He knew that confronting Mrs. Caldwell and the growing group of neighbors she was rallying was inevitable, but how everything would unfold was still a mystery. Lisa descended the stairs in silence, her steps soft on the wooden floor. She had noticed that the kitchen light was still on and wasn't surprised to find Jason deeply thoughtful. She approached him from behind, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders and resting her head on his back. "You've been at this for hours," she whispered softly. "It's not typical for you to lose sleep over something you can't control." Jason sighed, leaning back into her embrace for a moment before separating and running a hand over his face. "I can't shake it," he said. "Lisa, this City Hall meeting, it seems like everything depends on her. Mrs. Caldwell has already stirred so much, and I don't know what else she's planning." Lisa pulled out a chair and sat beside him, looking into his tired eyes. "You're right. She's been planting seeds of doubt about us in this community since the day we moved in, but this isn't just about her anymore. It's about the message we're sending to the entire neighborhood. People like her have power because they thrive on fear and division. We need to show everyone who we are and what we represent." Jason nodded, though the weight of responsibility still weighed on his shoulders. "But what if it goes wrong? What if this just gives her more platform to spread her garbage and turn more people against us?" Lisa shook her head. "It won't, because we're not going in there to fight her. We're going to tell our story, the truth, and let the community decide for themselves." Jason nodded, though the tension in his chest remained. He had always been the protector of his family, the one who stood firm in the face of adversity, but this was different. It wasn't just about his job or even himself. It was about his children, their future, and their sense of belonging. The City Hall meeting was scheduled for the following night. The Parkers had made sure to attend all the community events they could, school functions, neighborhood cleanups, charity campaigns, always with the intention of showing they were committed to Oakdale Heights and invested in the community's success. But it seemed like none of that mattered once Mrs. Caldwell began her silent campaign. Now, everything hinged on what would happen at that meeting. The next morning, Jason woke up early and decided to take a drive around the neighborhood. He needed to clear his mind to find a sense of calm before the meeting. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the rows of trees and streets. Oakdale Heights was, by all appearances, an idyllic suburb. The houses were well kept, the lawns maintained, and the streets clean. It was the kind of place Jason and Lisa had dreamed of raising their children, a place where they could build lasting friendships and feel a sense of community. But the cracks were starting to show. Now Jason knew that behind the pristine facade, Oakdale Heights wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Mrs. Caldwell represented a much deeper problem, an underground current of exclusion, and a desire to maintain a status quo that didn't include people like the Parkers. It was a reminder that no matter how successful or hardworking they were, there were still places where they would be seen as outsiders. Later that afternoon, Jason returned home to find Lisa preparing a late lunch for the children. Zoe and Marcus were at the kitchen table laughing over an inside joke only siblings could share. For a moment, seeing them so carefree and full of life tightened the knot in Jason's stomach. He loved this family more than anything, and seeing them happy, even amidst all the tension, gave him a renewed sense of purpose. After lunch, Lisa pulled Jason aside. "I talked to some of the other mothers in the park this morning," she said. "Not everyone is on Mrs. Caldwell's side. A couple of them told me they're tired of her controlling everything, trying to dictate who belongs here and who doesn't. They're planning to speak up at tonight's meeting." Jason's eyes lit up with surprise. "Really?" Lisa nodded. "Yes, it's not just us. She's been ruling this neighborhood like her own personal kingdom for years, and people are finally starting to resist. They're seeing her for who she really is." Jason felt a wave of hope. Maybe this wasn't going to be the disaster he had feared. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone in this fight after all. That night, the Parkers arrived at the City Hall building. The parking lot was filled with cars spilling onto the surrounding streets. It seemed like the entire neighborhood had come out to the meeting. Jason felt a nervous flutter in his stomach as they entered, but he kept his composure. He had faced much more dangerous situations in his career, but nothing had felt as personal as this. The council room was packed, people leaned against the walls, and every seat was filled. Jason saw Mrs. Caldwell sitting near the front, arms crossed, and her face marked by a haughty expression. She was surrounded by a small group of like-minded neighbors who had likely been the recipients of her whisper campaign. Jason exchanged a glance with neighbor's name, who gave him a reassuring nod. They took their seats near the back, surrounded by familiar faces, neighbors who had been friendly since the day they moved in. Jason felt a wave of gratitude toward them for their silent support. The council members took their places at the front of the room, and after a few minutes of opening remarks and routine agenda items, the floor opened for public comments. Jason's heart pounded as Mrs. Caldwell immediately stood up, her high-pitched and shrill voice beginning to speak. "I speak," she said. "I've lived in Oakdale Heights for over 30 years, she began. "In all that time, I've never seen the kind of disturbance we've been experiencing lately with certain new residents." She paused, giving a pointed look toward the Parkers. "They seem to think they can just move in, throw wild parties, make noise at all hours, and disturb the peace we've worked so hard to maintain." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jason felt a spark of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I anticipated this," he thought. "We are a community of respect." Mrs. Caldwell continued. "We have rules and standards that everyone must follow, but if we allow certain people to come in and break those rules, what does that say about us? What does that say about our future?" Jason couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, his imposing figure commanding attention as he walked to the front of the room. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "Good evening, everyone," Jason began, his voice firm but serene. "I'm Jason Parker, and my family and I moved to Oakdale Heights a few months ago. We came here because we believed this was a place where we could raise our children in peace, where we could be part of a community that values respect and justice. But what we've experienced has not been so." He paused, looking around the room. "From the moment we moved in, my family has been under constant scrutiny. Mrs. Caldwell has made it her mission to portray us as troublemakers, but I want to set the record straight. We're not here to disturb anything. We're here to live our lives like all of you. We follow the rules. We've contributed to the community, and we've only been trying to be good neighbors." Jason's words hung in the air, and the room remained silent. He could see Mrs. Caldwell shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her haughty expression fading. "We're not asking for special treatment," Jason continued. "We're simply asking to be treated like everyone else. We deserve to be here. We've earned our place, and no amount of rumors or whispers will change that." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, and Jason felt a surge of hope. This is our moment, he thought. The community speaks. Silence lingered in the City Hall room as Jason's words hung suspended in the air, the weight of his statement and the quiet dignity of his voice filling the room. And the determination in his eyes had a tangible effect on the room. It wasn't anger he was projecting, nor was it defiance. Instead, it radiated a calm and strength that was hard to ignore. Even those who had been influenced by Mrs. Caldwell's whisper campaign seemed to reconsider their stance as they looked from Jason to Mrs. Caldwell and back to him. Jason stood tall at the front of the room, scanning the faces of his neighbors. Some looked at him uncomfortably under his steady gaze. Others met his eyes with silent support, recognizing that what was happening was not just a dispute over a neighborhood barbecue. It was a test of their values, of what kind of community they wanted Oakdale Heights to be. Before anyone else could speak, a woman seated near the front stood up. Her name was Clara Johnson, a longtime resident of Oakdale Heights, and she had been friends with the Parkers since the moment they moved in. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle, maternal demeanor. She cleared her throat, and the room turned its attention to her. "I think it's time for all of us to take a step back and think about what's really happening here," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 25 years, and in all that time, I've seen families come and go. We've had our differences, but I've never seen a new family treated the way the Parkers have been treated." She looked at Mrs. Caldwell, who was sitting with her arms firmly crossed and her lips tightly pressed together. "Now I understand that not everyone has the same ideas about how things should be done, but it's a family that has only tried to be part of this community. They've shown respect, they've participated in our events, and from what I've seen, they've been good neighbors." Mrs. Caldwell opened her mouth to interrupt, but Clara raised her hand, silencing her. "Let me finish, Margaret," Clara continued, turning back to the crowd. "This isn't about a barbecue or a noise complaint. It's about something much bigger. We've allowed ourselves to be divided by rumors and assumptions, and that's not the kind of community I want to be part of. I want to live in a place where everyone is welcome, where we judge people by their actions, not by how long they've lived here or by the color of their skin." A murmur of approval spread through the room, and Jason could see people nodding in agreement. Clara had said what many had been thinking but were too afraid to express. Jason looked at Lisa, who was seated at the back of the room with their children. Her eyes were full of pride, and Marcus and Zoe sat quietly, absorbing everything. This is also for them, Jason thought. So they can see that standing up with dignity and grace is always the right choice, no matter how difficult the circumstances. Another neighbor, a younger man named Brian who had moved to Oakdale Heights just a few years earlier, stood up next. He was a quiet type, generally reserved, but had always been friendly with the Parkers when they walked by with their dog. "I'm Brian, and I just want to say something quickly," he began, nervously shifting as all eyes turned to him. "I don't know Jason well, but from what I've seen, he's a good guy. I don't understand why there's been so much fuss. I mean, I live just across the street, and I didn't hear anything loud or disruptive on the day of that barbecue. If anything, I was tempted to join because it smelled so good." Some people laughed, lightening the mood a bit. Brian continued, "I don't think it's right to make assumptions about people just because they're new or different from what we're used to. We already have enough division in the world as it is. Why bring it into our own neighborhoods?" Jason felt a surge of gratitude toward Brian and Clara. Their willingness to speak in support of his family meant more than they could know. Slowly, the tide was turning, but Mrs. Caldwell wasn't finished. She stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "This isn't about race," she snapped, her voice rising. "I've lived here long enough to know what's good for this community, and what's been happening lately isn't good. We've had too many changes, too many disturbances. It's not just about the Parkers. It's about the direction this neighborhood is taking. If we're not careful, we're going to lose everything that makes Oakdale Heights special." Her voice became shrill as she spoke, but this time the crowd didn't nod. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly uneasy with the intensity of her outburst. Mrs. Caldwell had overstepped her hand before another voice could. If this video has helped you connect more with yourself and inspired you on your growth journey, hit the like button and subscribe to the Inspirational Lives channel to discover more stories that will fill you with motivation and hope. I would love to hear your opinion, so leave a comment telling me how this story has impacted your life or what reflections it has left you with. And if you think this message can inspire someone you know, share it with your friends so they too can find inspiration and purpose in their lives.